Carly Swanner with KimandCaboodle.com and VisArts Center in Rockville, Maryland. And today we are going to do some stamps. Stamp making. Now this is part of a Zoom video which I am doing right now for VisArts, so we have a little bit of an audience today, but we are recording for posterity so that this is something you could view anytime, not just now and live. So in front of me I've got a little bit of clay. This is a standard 553, just groggy basic clay, but also I have a few other things here that we're going to be using. And so you can see I've got clay that has been slabbed out. One of my videos, one of the first videos I've got, where we made the box. Some of you, actually that has not posted yet to the Facebook page, but that will be posted to the Facebook page soon. But that shows you how to make a slab at home if you don't have a slab roller. Notice I have put underglaze on one side of this. You do not need to use underglaze, but underglaze, we're going to talk about how that helps in stamp making. Also, I've got a bit of a cube, not quite a cube, it's a rectangle, but it's cubed out. So this is also a thing you might want to pre-make before doing your stamps. And then I've got one that is a slab that has been joined together to make a roller stamp. You can use one color of underglaze or two. This is if you wanted to do one stamp pattern different than another. Just giving you some options for underglazes. But these are some stamps that I made in my free time. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to do these. These were made with cookie cutters to make the outside shape. So if you have cookie cutters on hand, that's always good to use. This is another one with a cookie cutter shape. And just dug that out. Same cookie cutter for the outside, and then I carved out the inside. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means here to have that excess on the outside. And this one I just did with textures. So same thing, circle cookie cutter. The other side's actually maybe a little bit better to show. That's the circle cookie cutter. And then this one was just a shape I made on my own. So this is, I just cut an angular shape out, no big deal. So first thing you want to do for your stamps is have a slab that you have, I like to have them at least about as thick as my finger. If that hasn't become kind of a normal thing to hear from my videos, I gauge everything by finger thickness because my finger is about a ½ inch thick. So I know that I've got at least a ½ inch thickness here. So just for a hand stamp like this, something I'm going to hold by the sides, I like to start with that kind of ½ inch availability so that I have enough depth to carve into. This is a little bit thicker though. For a rolling stamp, you're going to want something that's maybe a little bit thicker, about 1 inch thick. And the way that I did this is that I had the thicker clay here. I had it rolled out into the slab, and then I cut a straight line across and then joined it in the middle so that it made the donut, and then rolled it out to smooth it so that I could get it as smooth as possible. Really nice thing to do when making stamps is to have some boards pre-prepared, because as your stamps are drying, if you don't have them sitting underneath something that's level with a little bit of pressure, so whether you've got extra clay running around or like a cup of water you could put on top, that allows some pressure on top. That way you can have your stamps dry nice and flat so that they don't warp from drying. But those are just a few things you might want to have on hand first and foremost before you start working. So making a stamp, I started with a cookie cutter on some of these to get a shape. I'm just going to clear my area real quick and grab a cookie cutter real quick. Now if you don't have cookie cutters on hand, that's fine. You can find anything to trace with your tools. Let me find an interesting cookie cutter here. We have a star. We're going to grab a star. So I've got a star here that we're going to use. Just a little cookie cutter. It can be made of metal, made of plastic. And we're just going to insert that right into our clay. No problem. Pull that out. Very carefully push the clay out. You want to try and minimize exactly what, you don't want to warp the thickness of your pressure, so be careful when you're pushing your clay out. This clay has been sitting out a little bit, so it is on the verge of leather hard, which is a good thing. That makes it a little bit easier for me to, work with the clay faster. If you are starting with soft clay, then once you have cut out your stamp shapes, you kind of want them to sit a little bit until they are a little bit tougher, or use a hair dryer on them. So that way you have a little bit more stability with your stamps while they are setting up. The really trickiest part of making a stamp can be that if your clay is too soft and you're trying to carve into it, then it will just mush and not be really good for you to work with. I got some tools here. These are not the end all be all of tools. Again, use what makes you happy. These are just tools I found here at VisArts. Pencil, always great, nice and sharpened a little bit. Lots of different carving tools. I don't know how well you could see that's kind of a flat tool there with an angle. This one's a scoop. Got a little scoop and a point at the end. Also a needle tool, really good tool. This has a rounded end on it. I love any sort of tool. This is a smaller version of that. Any sort of tool with a rounded tip is great. Those are my favorites. I also love wooden pencils. That's what I call them. I think they're like I don't know the enamel pencils or whatever that they use in embossing. So lots of scoops are good. This one's just like not quite an X-Acto knife, but kind of an angled tip tool. I'll put my hand up against that so you can see the shape maybe. But lots of tools that you can use, lots of textures. You can use natural textures. Stamps can be made out of shells, of bark, of leaves. And this is more about how to carve your own. Now materials for carving your own, this is how to do it with clay, but you can also get soapstone. Soapstone's fantastic. I love using soapstone. You can use wood. All of these things are great. Just make sure that you know how to protect them over time. With wood especially, you want to be able to shellac it and cover it with some sort of protectant so that it doesn't, start to mold or degrade or warp over time. Ceramic is great because you can fire them and it'll last mostly forever unless you break it. So I've got my little star here, and I am just going to do a little pattern in it very quickly. So I'm just going to put little polka dots in it. And
message from Allison.
Yes.
Where can we get soapstone?
Soapstone, online is going to be your best bet. I know that some places that like Michael's will sell it on occasion, but it's just a stone and it comes in squares. You find it a lot with calligraphy stores. So if you happen to know in any sort of like Asian specific store that sells calligraphy goods like brushes and ink, a lot of times they might have a soapstone available that you can carve using. They usually have a kit of like metal tools that you can carve the soapstone with those specific metal tools. But it's really cheap. It's very affordable to get. Online is going to be your best option, honestly, because you can get a whole kit of different soapstones and different sizes, and they should come with the carving tools as well. Soapstone's great. Like I did some soapstone carving. Well, I'll say that 5 times fast. I did some soapstone carving when I was living in Japan, and that was a fantastic time. But here's my little dots that I've just poked. I'm going to let this sit up and dry. And this can be a stamp. Now, here's the thing, though, is that because of my edges here, the type of stamp, what this stamp is going to be useful for is going to be limited because these are all now recessed inside. And ideally, when you're making stamps, you want to be able to see what you're doing. And I'll have to press pretty hard into a slab or press the slab pretty hard into this, almost like a sprig mold. So a sprig mold's a little bit different than a stamp just because the sprig, you're trying to fill an area to make like a bug or a bird or a flower that's 3-dimensional. So to get a 3-dimensional stamp, something like this is going to be a little bit trickier because you're going to have to press the clay pretty firmly into this. So if you're not looking for something quite like that, I'm going to set this over here, and we're going to make another one. So kind of how would I make a better version of this? So cut out another star, push this down. So I know that I want to make some dots that are raised. So I'm actually going to take a bigger tool. This nice rounded tip is really nice and big. It's going to be less dots, but I'm going to gently twist this and make them not as deep. Be a little bit more thoughtful. It's one thing if you don't really know what you're going to put on your stamp, you know, a lot of people sometimes come into doing these kind of things and not really, you know, like, I know I want to make something, but I don't know what I want to make. It's good to sit and give yourself some pause. Think about what it is you really do want to make. That helps you in the end, really. So I'm just very gently twisting this tool. If you want to, you can add a little bit of cornstarch. I'm going to grab some cornstarch here in a minute for a different reason. But like the metal of this tool is sticking to the clay because the clay's still a little bit moist. I want to make sure that, you know, nothing's getting caught in there. But you could sprinkle a little cornstarch on top so that this didn't stick quite so much. But yeah, just doing a little pattern. And we'll put one in the middle as best as I can. Okay, so this is a slightly better version, or much better version in my opinion, than this one because we're a little bit more shallow. And it's gonna be a lot easier to fill these voids than this one. And we're gonna do some demonstrations with clay later on to show you how these work, you know, for better or worse. But we're gonna let those dry out. So that's if this kind of stamp is if you wanted to make something that has a raised pattern. These are very similar to that. So where you see the gray, that is what's gonna be raised on your surface. So all of these where you see the gray, those are gonna be the raised parts. The recessed parts, the imprint is gonna be where you see the color. So whether you're carving it yourself, drawing it yourself. Now, for anything that you're going to do that is recessed, so this heart would actually put a heart impression into the clay. I'm gonna get some cornstarch real quick so that we can see this now, because that stamp is pretty good and ready to go. Now, ideally, when you're using a stamp, you're actually gonna wanna fire these first in a Bisque Fire at minimum. They can go to your cone 6 firing if that's what you're firing to, but you do want to at least have them Bisque fired. That's the best. But cornstarch, just your average, any brand, you know, I don't, you know, Argo's not paying me any money, but that's what we have in studio here. So I've got my stamp here that has not been fired yet. I'm going to dip it into the cornstarch, dust it off. So it's got a little bit of cornstarch. And I'm going to grab my extra clay here. And so this is if I wanted a stamp that is going to have a recessed result. Oop, I got to press a little bit harder. And unfortunately, like because this isn't Bisque fired yet, I've got to be really gentle. I don't want to press too hard because it can break the stamp. So there we go. So we've got a nice little heart that's been carved. Yo, sorry, question.
Not a question, but a comment.
Yes.
I just wanted to note that in the chat, Lisa provided a link on Dick Blick Online to where they can get their soapstone.
Oh, awesome. There you go. So Lisa in the chat provided a link online to Dick Blick's for the soapstone stuff. So thanks, Lisa. That's awesome. But you could see, like, here's our little heart impression. So when you are making a raised, when you want something to be recessed, remember that you need to have it be a raised stamp versus this is recessed now, it will come out raised later. So, and this is still like, this is definitely not firm enough for me to make a stamp just yet. So I'm not going to demo that little dude. Let me see here. I do have a triangle here though that shows both recessed and raised. So this area here where you see the orange, that part will be flat to the clay. This will also be flat to the clay. In here, this interior is going to be raised. So we're going to cover that in some cornstarch. Like, I want to make sure I get it in all the areas, not just on the tops. So I'll show you what I'm just trying not to make a colossal mess. In this instance, it would be maybe ideal for me to have like a paintbrush to get some of this cornstarch through, but we'll use the circle or we'll use this guy here, this tool, the rounded tool, to push some of that around. Tap that out because it doesn't need to be super dusty. And now I'm going to be very firm but gentle in pressing this in hope that I don't break my stamp that hasn't been fired yet. So pressing that down. Just kind of not, I don't want to just do a huge force at one time, so I'm just kind of pressing it repeatedly. Oh, there we go. So I don't know how well this is visible on camera. I'm going to try and dust this off a little bit. But you can see here, oh, that's actually very easy to see. You can see how that's raised up in that triangle now, and these are all recessed. So that is the result of this stamp here. And so the really neat thing about doing stamps like this is that now I could angle this, you know, change the direction of my stamp and make a pattern. There we go. So now you can, that's even better that second time around. So you can do continued patterns of your stamps. Now I'm working on the slab. So that's this is slab specific right here, is that I can do that nice pressure, downward pressure. Ideally, if I'm working with a thrown piece, then I'm gonna want to absolutely have this be bisque fired first, so that I can be a little bit more gentle, because your bisque piece, you're gonna wanna work with it being a little bit softer, not quite leather hard, so that you can, you know, have one hand on the inside like this in the vertical area and be pressing gently into it to get your results. Because the more gentle I press with this, you can see that because this is a hard slab clay, I can't see my impression here. But that's with hand stamps. Another thing with hand stamps that the width of this is really good to point out, because I have something to grip. And if this is awkward to grip as a stamp, don't be afraid in your stamp making process. This is a little bit too dry, but you can also make little nubs and have a little bit of water nearby to do a score slip attach and make a handle. And that way you have something to hold on to instead of trying to manipulate your fingers around the stamp, especially if you make one that's particularly small. Then having a little handle is good to, you know, push that stamp in. This one I wanted to show off because actually this is the, I wanted to show that, you know, this was my carving process here. So I just drew a bunch of little lines on the surface and then chose which ones I wanted to keep and dug around those. And this is going to be a little bit more fragile to try to press, but I'm going to try and press this in so you can see that pattern. But yeah, it's a lot of, you know, stamp making can be as time consuming as you want it to be, depending on what kind of stamp you want to make. Let's see what this does without, hopefully without breaking it. If any stamp is going to break, it's going to be this one. Just because it's got all these little fragile bits on it. Wiggle that free. Ooh, that's neat. These are all first time views for me. I don't know how well, yeah, that's some of that cornstarch is stuck in there. But you can see we got little triangle patterns. And so it's just really neat to do things like this so that you can see, you know, different patterns. If you wanted to do something continuous, you know, this just makes for really neat things that you can do at home. Same with like something like this, where when you're pressing it in, you can turn it so that it's not always the same direction that it's facing each time. So if you're trying to do some neat patterns. Also, stamps are great for if you're doing something very specific. So this was going to be a leaf, but when I saw the initial pattern that I carved out, it looked very wing-like, so I turned it into a wing. So I could use this and, you know, have little wings inside of a project. Another great way to do the opposite of a stamp, though, which is actually why I made this stamp, is that I can press this in. And this goes for the triangle one, too. The triangle one works really good for this, too. So if you made a raised stamp, but you actually wanted it to be recessed, so I've got my stamp pressed in there pretty good. Now I'm going to cut it out using my needle tool. I'm going to cut around it. Pull that out very gently. And now I have the opposite. So once I clean this up, now I have the opposite, so that when I push this into my clay, it's actually going to give me this version. so that it will be in the clay itself, it will be recessed. Whereas like, you know, if I push it, if I use the stamp now, this is what my result will be. So if you want both the kind of 3D version where it sticks out and the not 3D version where it goes into your piece, you have that option now by using that stamp to make the opposite type. I hope that makes sense. A little bit tricky, but the same thing with the triangles is that I can use these as their own individual stamps as an opposite to this. So I could have both patterns on one piece where part of it looks like this result and other parts look like this result too. So that could be an interesting, you know, effect for a piece depending on what you're making. But so let's move on to the other things. Really good, I did mention this guy a little bit, but yeah, really good is making sure that whatever stamp you've got, if you're gonna do like a recessed, like with this heart shape here, give yourself a lot of clearance so that you have enough room to really press that shape in. If it's too shallow, then you're not gonna get as strong of an effect. So like with these here, these little scritches, they're not gonna do really anything unless your clay is super wet, in which case then your stamp will actually stick to your piece and you won't get as many really good results out of this. So make sure that you've carved deep enough into your piece, your stamp, so that you are getting visual results out of it. Hopefully that also makes sense. Let me see here. There's so many things about stamps. The rolling stamp. So a lot of times you might want to make a continuous pattern. So that's what the usefulness of these rolling stamps are. You could also use these sides as textures as well. So I could, you know, just do a pattern through this to make, I'm just doing something kind of crazy. So these would make, these carvings that I'm making right now would be raised when I pressed them. So you can see I could do this all the way around and then have a project that has these, you know, funky circles all over it. For the rolling stamp, you want to carve all along your roll. And again, think of what is going to be raised, what's going to be recessed. If you just want a, you know, standard continuous kind of just lines, you know, make your roller as wide as you want to. Don't feel like you're limited in its width. Just before you fire them, you're going to want to make sure that they are really 100% bone dry because you don't want them to blow up in the kiln. So make sure that they're dry. Notice how deep I have dug into this, and this is why having that like 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep or thickness is important, because you really want to make sure that you're digging quite far into these so that you're going to get a result. Again, if I only do something that is like this shallow, my result might not be as good. Now again, test it. You know, you might find that whatever clay you're using, all clay is different. So you might find that whatever clay you're using responds really well to something more shallow, and that this is too deep for you. So keep that in mind, that, you know, have something nearby that you can put some, you know, after you've fired your piece, or if it's dried enough that you can use the cornstarch on it, you know, practice it and see what happens. See if it works for, you know, on your clay and what you're doing, because this is just one type of clay. And it might respond, you know, it's going to respond differently than a clay that is softer or harder. You might find even digging very deep is still not good enough for your clay because you've got a really grog heavy clay. Your clay has a lot of sand in it. So keep in mind that, you know, not all patterns are going to work for all projects. But you know, we've got a lot of rolling stamps here at VisArts. They've got leaf patterns, they've got music notes, they've got a piano keyboard. So, you know, I'm just doing lines just out of simplicity's sake, but you could do all sorts of different shapes along this border and then have it, you know, repeat itself as it's rolling across your pattern. The last thing, well, and this is kind of the same thing. So before I get to the last stamp kind of tip that I want to give. This is the same thing that you can do, is that instead of a rolling stamp like this, you can do different stamp patterns. Let's say you have a project in mind that is going to use, you want to do 4 different patterns on one project, you can do a stamp like this where each side is different. Now keep in mind, you want to make sure that however deep you're digging is going to, it's not going to break through to the rest of the stamp. But you can also like do a stamp press, turn it, press, turn it, press, turn it, so that you have a continuous stamp with different patterns going across your project. And then also your ends too. Let's say you wanted to put something on the ends, you could also press that into each portion as well. And I just kind of wanted to have this. I'm not going to carve into this because that would be super time consuming. But this is just another really good idea for those of you though that maybe don't have rolling stamps at home or anything like that. You could also pound this out on the corners and turn it into a rolling stamp. So if you have, instead of buying a roller that has a stamp on it, which we have plenty of those here at Viz, and they're like what, $15, $20 a roller at most, I think. You could probably find them cheaper. But if I roll this out and take the time to make this smooth where I can roll this with ease, then I can put carvings on this and make it a continuous wide rolling stamp, kind of like your rolling pin, so to speak. So instead of buying a wooden rolling pin and carving into it, which is totally fine. If you find a cheap rolling pin at a garage sale or something, have at it. Carve into it with some wood carving tools, make a pattern. But you can also make it out of clay. Now this sort of thing is once you've finished carving it, if the carving is not deep, you do want to take a core out of this. Otherwise it's going to take forever to dry. And you just don't want this to, explode in a kiln. If you're not going to take a core out of it, then make sure you're preheating your kiln for at least like 15 hours so that this has a chance to dry. Or just set it outside, let it dry outside. It'll dry in like a week, it'll be fine. So my last thing that I really wanted to make mention of is words. So a lot of times people want to do words with stamps, which is great, but keep in mind that when you are doing any sort of lettering or messaging, you have to write it backwards. So don't just, oh, I'm going to write my name. I'm going to write Kim and I'm going to stick it on a cup. Well, that's great, except it's going to be Mick with a backwards K. So, know what letters, it's great to have letters like T, I, M, W, O. All those, they don't need a reflection of themselves because they are themselves, just that way. But anytime you're going to do a stamp where you have something, or even if it's just you're drawing something freehand, so like I'm gonna write my name just for sake of not having anything better to do, but I want to make sure that it is reversed. So I'm starting with that M. Notice I'm just using a regular pencil, and every time I kind of come out of that, I'm wiping away the boogers. And these are, even though I will have like this fairly cleaned up, all of these stamps before I use them, I will want them to be bone dry. And then once they are bone dry, I will be firing them, or I'm not firing it, I will be sanding them or smoothing them out with a bristle pad, the green portion of the sponge that you have in your kitchen possibly, to get all the excess boogers off. You want these stamps to be as clean as possible and not sharp. So just like with any ceramics project, you want to make sure that your pieces are not sharp, because if they are sharp, then it's not going to be fun to use them and get cut by them. So I'm just cleaning this up as much as I can. But it's nice having that underglaze down there so that I can see exactly where I have cut. My K might look a little bit like an H until I can clean it up. That's okay. We'll figure it out. But you can get as fanciful as you want. Like I'm adding little doodle bops to the end of these, because that's a technical term. Flowers, leaves, whatever it is, we see this backwards, but once this is dry, and I can, at this point, if I like my wording, then I can cut around my stamp, so I'm not just having a big old lump of clay everywhere. And break this out. And so now in this case, like maybe once it's dry, I might make this a little bit bigger. While this is still wet, I might put a little handle on the end of it so that it's something I can hold. You know, the bigger the stamp, you might want to have a few little nubbies on the end there. They don't have to be pretty, just, you know, something that you can hold. So, but yeah, once this is done, I can just right in there and it will make my stamp. That was actually upside down, so this would actually be right side up. So you all can kind of see how that says my name, because you can all see it visually in the reverse view. But, you know, when I'm looking at it, it's definitely backwards. But yeah, just make sure that you're careful with your stamp making, that you are, you know, plan ahead, first of all. If you're really unsure of what you want to do, look online for pictures of patterns and stuff that you like. You might find like an origami pattern that you're really fond of. You can print that out, put that on your clay, trace it with a pencil so that you've got your shapes there, then lift it up and then start actually digging out your pattern. You know, some people like, you know, again, like making your own leaves, making your own flowers, whatever it is that you want to do. You can take a leaf from outside, press it into your clay, and then lift it and carve further into it. But yeah, just make sure that you're having fun. You're making sure your stamps are dry enough. And once they're dry, that you're finishing them off, making them look nice and pretty, and then firing them so that they can be used, you know, continuously. But I hope that that explains a little bit about stamp making. And I will be taking questions and comments after this video in the live Zoom chat. But any other, oh, we got one question before we go.
Question from Sue. Did you put underglaze on the clay to make it easier to see the design?
Yes, I did that. So I think I said that at the beginning of the video, but it does bear repeating. I did put underglaze on these once I had slabbed the clay out. And for these, it was after I had cut the shapes. So I cut the shape first, then put the underglaze on. But for this one, you know, where if you just are gonna make something freehand, I just did the whole thing. But yeah, pick a color you like. Pick a color that's easy to see versus the color of the clay. But yes, underglaze is, you know, a really nice tool so that you know exactly where you've been digging and where you have not been digging. It just makes things a little bit easier in the end so that you can see your stamp. And also, it makes it a little bit easier if you plan to use these for underglaze. So you can use these to dip in underglaze and then put that pattern onto your piece. It's not just for doing three-dimensional aspects to your clay. You can use these as like a rubber stamp and dip them with underglaze and put them on your piece. So that's actually a really good thing to bring up. So thank you for that, Sue, before we stop the video. But yeah, I mean, lots of things that you can do. But any other further questions, if you're in the Facebook VisArts page, then please attach to this video once it gets uploaded. Any comments or questions you've got, we're happy to answer them. But thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found this educational and if not, at least mildly entertaining. And I will see you all next time. Thanks.